是来自英国高地与群岛大学的尼克·卡特教授。他为我们介绍的获奖项目是苏格兰奥克尼群岛布罗德加的尼斯遗址。有请。
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Shanghai Archaeological Forum for the wonderful prize on behalf of the whole team, and also for giving me the chance to come here to do a presentation. Whenever the prehistory of Europe is spoken about, this is usually the image that immediately springs to mind: Stonehenge, that amazing standing edifice. And yet, 500 miles to the north of Stonehenge lies a small island group off the northern coast of Britain, the Orkney Isles, where there's an old saying, if you scratch the surface of Orkney, it bleeds archaeology. And this is nowhere truer than in the middle of the main island, where we have some of the most iconic prehistoric monuments anywhere in Europe. And in recognition of this, some of them were granted World Heritage status in 1999, the heart of Neolithic Orkney. There's Maze Howe, arguably the finest chambered tomb in Northern Europe, with its entrance passage aligned on the midwinter sunset. I'm sure it should be on everybody's bucket list. Amazing sight. There's Skara Brae, best preserved Neolithic village in Northern Europe. The Ring of Brodgar, third largest stone circle. Originally probably 60 stones surrounded by a massive rock-cut ditch. And the stones of Ness, the kind of smaller sister to the Ring of Brodgar, which may not compete with it in size, but these amazing monoliths still survive to almost 5 meters in height. But it's only really been since the designation of the World Heritage Site and the subsequent publication of the research agenda that our understanding of these monuments have really came on in leaps and bounds. And the technique which has perhaps most illuminated this landscape is, of course, geophysics. And in order to put the sites into a wider context, back in 2002, we embarked on a large-scale geophysics program all around these monuments. And although we knew that the underlying geology of Orkney was very susceptible to producing good geophysical results, what we discovered had just been quite outstanding. We've now discovered an area, surveyed an area of about 300 hectares. And just a couple of examples. Here you see the area just behind the stones of Ness, flat green fields, or so it seems, but apply geophysics to it, and there's a little bit more surviving. And it's not just a single phase of activity, but we have everything there from prehistoric right the way through to medieval field systems, including the site of Big Howe, which is one of these Iron Age rock sites. But the first two fields we did as part of this study were the two fields at the very tip of the Brodgar Peninsula, the Ness of Brodgar. And this really gave us an inkling of what we expected, or what we didn't expect to find really, because at the very tip of the peninsula was this mass of anomalies, massive features, anomalies of every size, shape and description, all hidden within this high background magnetic reading. But what did this mean? What was the significance of this? What was the implications for this landscape? And indeed, the Ness of Brodgar itself, this huge mound, which I think most of us archaeologists had always just driven past, not given it much attention. But the following year, after we conducted the geophysics, this large stone slab was uncovered when the field was last ploughed. Obviously man-made or man-altered. But when we investigated it, expecting to find maybe a Bronze Age kist, a Bronze Age coffin, we discovered the top of a wall. And the angularity, the symmetry of this wall got us quite excited because a few years earlier, at the site of Barnhouse, just behind the stones of Ness, a structure exhibiting very similar architecture. Here in structure 2, you can still see the same very angular corner buttressing was uncovered. But what are the implications for the rest of the geophysics results? Well, over the next few seasons, we mounted a series of test pitting, trial trenching, and we tried to avoid all the major geophysical anomalies. But lo and behold, in every single test pit we opened, bar one, I think, there was archaeology present at varying depths. And it dawned on us that this whole mound, which is about 300 meters long, 100 meters wide, and rises to a height of about 7 meters above sea level, is in fact artificial in nature. In order to investigate it or get a better understanding of the nature of this, though, we had to open up slightly bigger trenches. But even what you see today, this is still less than 10% of the site. In our largest trench, Trench P, this is an aerial shot of it from this season, we've uncovered the remains of several structures. But these aren't small domestic structures, these are quite large, massive, monumental buildings. And perhaps in its heyday, it looked something like this. I say perhaps, this was done for the National Geographic article a few years ago, and a lot of toing and froing between us, but we eventually agreed that, well, this was publishable, until I discovered that the artist who produced this was the same guy who did the backgrounds for the Lord of the Rings films. So I'm not quite sure if he fully understood the scale of it. But the Ness of Brodgar is, as I said, more like a tell site. And we have dates ranging from really almost the earliest Neolithic activity in Orkney right the way through the whole of the Neolithic. So from about 3,500 to about 2,300 calibrated BC. But also, as we've discovered, earlier activity going back into the Mesolithic period and later activity into the Iron Age. And although we can only really see the later buildings, by studying the way that they're collapsing and subsiding, you can kind of join up the dots and see what's lying underneath. So you can start to build up a whole sequence of the later activity on the site, where there's, to begin with, some fairly large buildings, but then these get even bigger, augmented, totally changed in some respects, followed by even larger ones. But then you start to see a whole change in the style of architecture and the series of smaller structures towards the end of the life of the site. But when you look at the major structures that we've so far uncovered, they all seem to exhibit the same theme or style of architecture, the use of these kind of pairs of stone piers, creating side recesses within the buildings. And although they're all similar in theme, they're all different. And this difference, we think, could be due to each one representing a different community wanting its presence to be felt at the Ness. And this style of or architecture based on a theme, you can also see in some of the stall chamber tombs in Orkney, which again perhaps represent different communities. But everything about the Ness seems to be on that kind of larger scale. When you look at the scale of, for instance, structure 8, over 20 meters long, with 5 or 6 hearths, the preservation, the quality of the stonework, and some of it even reaches even better than that. For instance, in structure 12, where again you can see these pairs of opposed stone piers, but the stonework there with well, 3 entrances. But the quality of the stonework is even better, and a lot of it is being dressed. Some of the sandstone blocks you can see here, the corners round off, the faces smoothed off. But also the style of roofing. All too often in prehistory, we think of just a simple thatch for roofing. But in the Ness, we've discovered evidence for stone slates. And this is a technique which you can still see being used in Orkney today. And these architectural features are also matched by the unusual nature of the small find tool assemblage, where we see new types of stone tools being produced, stone spatulas, cushion stones. but also material coming in from all the way across Britain, pitch stone, a type of obsidian coming from Arran down the west coast, axe blanks coming from from the great axe factories in Cumbria, and even some ceramics, which the closest parallels we have is from around the Stonehenge area. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Ness is also the amount of decorated stone. We've now catalogued, I think, in fact, over 850 examples, which makes it by far the largest assemblage of Neolithic art in the UK, in fact, more than the rest of the UK put together. But the art isn't just limited to incised and pecked designs, but also the use of colour. We see different coloured sandstones being incorporated into the builds, and even the application of coloured pigments to the walls. And the use of colour isn't just limited to the buildings, but also for the first time in British prehistory, the recognition of colour on the ceramics. So suddenly, the usual grooved ware ceramic illustration changes from this kind of monochrome to something a little more psychedelic. But the structures, the finds, it's all wonderful, but then you also realise that in its heyday, the Ness was enclosed by within a massive walled enclosure. This was first recognised on the north side of the site that faces the ring of Brodgar, where we see a wall about 4 metres wide being constructed. And then later on, the addition of an outer revetment, widening it to almost 6 metres wide. So it soon became known as the Great Wall of Brodgar. Maybe not quite on the scale of what you have here in China, but in an Acadian context, something pretty massive. This we traced right the way across the peninsula through geophysics and through trial trenching. But when we went back and looked at the original geophysics again, there we had the northern boundary wall, but on the south side, there's also a linear feature, which we started to suspect was the kind of mirror image of the northern boundary wall. And lo and behold, yes, there was a wall there that was pretty well preserved, almost 6 feet in height, 1.8 metres in height. So we joined up the dots and made this enclosure around all the major structures. But in fact, just over the last season, we opened up 2 extra trenches on the sides, the flanks of the peninsula, and the wall doesn't appear to be there. Shock, horror. But at the Ness, we can start to build up a whole idea about the sequence of the Neolithic, kind of looking at the refinement of it. And this is applicable, for instance, around about 2,950, where we see quite major changes happened at the Ness. Sorry, I don't know what's happened to that slide. Everything's coming up double. But anyway, structure 8 is partially demolished, and it's replaced by structure 10, this humongous building, which first showed up on the geophysics as a very large geophysical anomaly, which we didn't think could be Neolithic. But lo and behold, when we stripped away the turf, it was a structure. But a structure the like of which we'd never really seen before. And this is a slightly, what shall we say, clinical representation of what it might have looked like, but it does give you an idea of the grandeur of this building when it was first built. It incorporates walls which are about 4 to 5 metres thick, and it's surrounded by a massive paved walkway with a kind of forecourt area out the front. But everything about structure 10 just seems to be a bit different. When you look at its alignment, it's aligned exactly east-west, so aligns with Maze Howe, the big chamber tomb in the distance, but also the equinox sunrise. It incorporates standing stones, including this one with an hourglass-shaped hole that's been drilled through it. And although it might seem a bit different, it's in fact a bit like the earlier houses or the earlier structures of the Ness, which I believe are kind of elongated versions of the early Neolithic houses you see, for instance, at Scarrow Brae that incorporate piers and buttresses, whereas structure 10, it's more like the monumentalization of the later Neolithic houses we see at Scarrow Brae. But even structure 10 doesn't last forever, and we see another kind of phase of change within a couple of generations only of its primary construction. We see some of the other buildings being altered, but in structure 10 we see the incorporation of corner buttresses and other smaller structures being built round about it. So there's the addition of these corner buttresses, which are perhaps a reflection of four coaster structures that we see elsewhere in the British Neolithic. And during this rebuild, it includes the incorporation of a whole range of quite special votive offerings, including a human arm bone, an eagle bone, calf stone ball, special decorated pottery, and another large decorated block of stone. But the Ness goes on stuttering, so to speak, for another couple of hundred years. And structure 10 eventually is filled in, it's almost demolished, decommissioned. And as part of that decommissioning event, in the passageway that surrounds it, we see the deposition of quite an extraordinary deposit. And by carefully recording this massive bone deposit using laser scanning, photogrammetry, etc., and very careful excavation by, here we see Dr. Ingrid Mainland of the Archaeology Institute in Orkney, we managed to see that this massive bone deposit was very structured in its nature and consisted of the remains of somewhere between 400 and 600 cattle, which had been apparently, judging by the radiocarbon dates, all killed at the same time. And this decommissioning event seems to coincide roughly with the end of the Ness, but also the beginning of the Bronze Age. And this might seem, a very simplistic type of equation: end of the Ness equals end of the Neolithic equals beginning of the Bronze Age. But just above that bone deposit, we did find a single sherd of beaker pottery and this barbed and tanged arrowhead. But I think the beaker influence in what's happening in Orkney towards the end of the Neolithic is more to do with a kind of indirect reason, with the beakers being introduced further south are actually disrupting some of the kind of trade network, the contact networks that we see established through the Neolithic period. But the special nature of the Ness is also reinforced by this mound that we see at the very tip of the peninsula. It's shown as a prominent feature in the landscape on these early maps. And when we looked at the geophysics, we saw there was a series of concentric anomalies at the very tip of the peninsula that seemed to coincide with this large mound. So we opened up Trench T, and but lo and behold, those concentric anomalies had nothing to do with what was happening at the Ness during the Neolithic, but it represented a large Iron Age stone revetted ditch that ran around the mound. But then we realized what the rest of the mound was. And it's one of the largest, if not the largest, midden rubbish trash heaps in Neolithic Britain. It's over 70 meters in diameter and today survives to a height of somewhere between 4 and 5 meters. But was probably originally a much, much more prominent feature in the landscape. And this mound, I think, is a deliberate construct by our Neolithic people who were using it to reflect the status, the affluence, the conspicuous consumption that was going on at the Ness. But underneath it, the story didn't finish there. We started to see elements of structure starting to appear, orthostats, wall lines, drains, etc. And it was a sudden realization that some of these, what we thought of as separate upright stones, were in fact all part of a single stone. A massive monolith had been set on edge that defined part of a chamber, in fact, series of chambers. And this has been termed Structure 27. Should find something a bit more romantic to call it, but it is unique in every respect. And on the inside, this would have been the appearance of these massive orthostats sat on edge, almost creating kind of stone skirting board around this building. But these were helping to support a series of orthostats behind it that would have clad the whole of the interior of this building. So the Ness was something quite extraordinary. And throughout its life, it possibly had many, many different functions. And maybe it was a kind of centre of congregation that Colin Renfrew and Michael Boyd were talking about this morning. But whatever it was something quite special that we share today through a number of aspects, through guided tours which attract tens of thousands of people each season, the involvement of a whole range of the community, and taking it out there, sharing the Ness through our website, through television, and through more populous publications, and also through the support of a whole range of different people. But if you want to help support us, why not join us in a glass of Highland Park whiskey, special Ness Brodgar Legacy Edition, launched earlier this year, and I can highly recommend it. Thank you.
谢谢。